Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Escape to Love by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. New York, 10th of September 1881. Catherine Mayfield rolled her neck on her shoulders before she let out a heavy sigh. The whir of sewing machines surrounded her, mingled with the shouts of impatient men and the desperate sighs of tired women. If despair had a scent, Catherine was certain it would be of fabric, oil, sweat, and the dark mold growing on the walls of the row house. She had been working since 5 that morning, and after 12 hours of sewing until her arms, neck, and back ached, she knew at least 4 to 6 more hours of work lay ahead of her before the day could be seen to be at a close. This wasn't the life or the work she chose, but it was her only option. Having been raised in an orphanage, Catherine had always dreamed that the day the doors opened to her freedom, she would find a country ripe with opportunity and dreams just waiting to come true. Instead, she had been kicked out of the orphanage on her 16th birthday without any kind words of inspiration or even an invitation to visit. Room had to be made for the new arrivals, and at the age of 16, Catherine was deemed old enough to take care of herself. And she had. Although she wouldn't view the past 3 years as taking care of herself, she had barely survived. Finding work in one of the sweatshops sounded like a wonderful idea. Catherine didn't know much about being a seamstress, but she was eager to learn. She imagined working her way up to supervisor and one day owning her own empire of factories. She soon learned that certain possibilities were more impossible than she could ever imagine. For 3 years, she had been worked from sunrise till long after sunset, 6 days a week. Often she would only be paid for 4 days. No one who worked in the row houses ever complained. Those who dared to complain were relieved of their duties by the Polish magnate who owned the sweatshop, ensuring all reasons for complaint were nullified there and then. Catherine couldn't afford to lose her income, meager as it was. When Susan was still around, life had been almost bearable. They would joke while sewing garments and find ways to stay positive between shifts. But Susan had left 3 months before, leaving Catherine alone with only her misery for company. "Katie! Quick, here comes Alexei," Beatrix whispered as she shoved Katie aside. Catherine looked up to see Alexei Lakov enter through the doors, a smirk of pompousness in place as he glared at every woman and man in the small, crowded room. How many? It was a question everyone dreaded, but one that needed to be answered. They were in the business of making coats, and unless they produced 15 coats per day, their workday wasn't over and they weren't paid. Alexei Lakov was one of the few immigrants who managed to drag himself out of the back streets and into the pound seats. He ran his operation with a tight fist and a narrow gaze that didn't miss a thing. Right now, his eyes were on Catherine, who had dared to take a short break. "Miss Mayfield, since you're clearly done, I take it my 15 coats are on the rack." Beatrix sighed from beside Catherine, shaking her head. "We have 12, Mr. Lykov," Catherine said, with her chin held high. Being dependent on this job didn't mean she had to pander to Alexei's ego when he treated them like gutter rats. "Really? Well now, that's a shame because I need 15 coats every day. That means your day isn't done yet." His face contorted into a wry grin, and he continued with more vehemence than ever before, shouting at Catherine, "So finish my 15 coats." Without a word, he turned to leave the room, slamming the door in his wake. Beatrix sniffed quietly beside her. "He'd take the whip to us if he could, I tell ya." "You're I've never seen a man so heartless in my entire life." Catherine brushed a hand over Beatrix's shoulder. "It's all right, and if he takes a whip to us, he'd better know that Big Bill might just find another use for his wrench." Beatrix smiled faintly. "This isn't the life I dreamed of, Katie." Beatrix was a middle-aged Italian woman who had come to the New World with her husband and dreams of a better future. Her husband had been killed during the ocean voyage, leaving Beatrix destitute. The reason behind Beatrix and her husband wanting to come to New York in the first place continued to baffle Katie. "Why did you come?" Katie asked carefully. Beatrix shrugged as she resumed her sewing. "There's an Italian saying in my neighborhood. I came to America because I heard the streets were paved with gold. When I got here, I found out three things. First, the streets weren't paved with gold. Second, they weren't paved at all. And third, I was expected to pave them." Katie smiled sadly, knowing that was a little too close to the truth. She put her head down and continued to work, knowing that the sooner she found a way out of Alexei Lakov's stronghold, the sooner she could start her search for a better life. But first, they had 3 more coats to finish. Chapter 2. New York, 17th of September, 1881. A letter from Susan proved to be the catalyst to help Katie find the solution to her problems. For months, she had been trying to find a way out of the row house that Alexei ruled with an iron fist. She saved every dime she possibly could, but between paying the rent on her one-bedroom tenement home and buying just enough food to survive, she more often than not had none to spare. Moreover, Alexei often short-paid them when they failed to produce a minimum of 15 coats for the day. The ruthless Pole didn't factor in that sewing machines broke, patterns were sometimes complicated, or the pressure on the rest of the workers when one or more of the employees fell ill. All he cared about was his 15 coats. After arriving home from the row house late that Saturday evening, Katie found Susan's letter waiting for her. With great excitement, she tore it open, eager to hear about her friend's new life. She still couldn't believe that Susan boarded a train to the enigmatic West to marry a man she had never met. The thought was as far-reached as marrying royalty to Katie. They had spent 2 years together in the orphanage before they moved into the tenement together. For the last 3 years, they had taken turns sleeping in the bed and spent their evenings dreaming of a better life. This was the first letter Katie had received from Susan, and she was desperate to learn whether her friend had found happiness or strife. After making a cup of tea, without sugar because she couldn't afford it, she sat down before the coal stove to warm her hands and began reading. "My dearest Katie, I hope with all my heart that you have been well and in good health. I know you have been very concerned since my departure, and I know that you must have been fraught with concern about my well-being. I am writing to you as Mrs. P.T. Barnum. You read correctly that I am a married woman. Upon my arrival in Sioux Falls, I wasn't sure I could go through with marrying a stranger. To be honest, I considered getting straight back on the train, but I couldn't afford the return fare. Peter welcomed me, and although I liked him at first sight, I was hesitant to open my heart. My dear Katie, how wrong I was. Peter is generous and kind, and a God-fearing man of good morals. He respects and honors me and has given me the life we always dreamed of. As the owner of a mercantile store, he works long hours, but never complains. Between my chores as a wife, I help him at the store and meet new people every day. People so different from the ones we knew in New York. People who ask after your well-being. People who care, although they might seem a little frightful at first. Katie, I have fallen in love with my husband, and I am overjoyed to let you know that we are expecting our firstborn. It is with great regret that I do not know when we will meet again, but with joy that I wish you only the best. I know you scoffed at my plans, but Katie, I took a chance and it paid off. I enclose with my letter a copy of the most recent Matrimonial Times. I do not wish to coerce you into anything you do not wish to be a party to, but it breaks my heart knowing that you're working for Alexei and barely eking out a living. Read it, Katie. Just maybe a handsome bachelor might catch your eye within its pages. Remember, Katie, our dreams can only come true if we chase them. All my love, your dearest friend, Susan Barnum." Katie brushed away the tear that slipped over her cheek. She couldn't fathom doing what Susan had, but to read of Susan's happiness was heartwarming, to say the least. To have a home, a husband who cared for her, and to be with child had proved all of Susan's dreams to be realized. In prosody, although Katie had never harbored dreams of having children of her own, she could allow herself to envy her friend for just a brief moment. She glanced at the Matrimonial Times and shook her head with a wry smile. Susan had a snowflake's chance in the heat of summer if she thought Katie might write to a perfect stranger for a chance of reprieve from a life she had come to know. Once she had bathed and changed into a nightdress, she stoked the coals in the wood stove again. The evenings were becoming cooler with every passing day, and regardless of the number of coats Katie produced, she couldn't afford one of her own. After scouring the small kitchen, she found nothing to eat but a stale piece of bread and a chunk of moldy cheese. She imagined the delicious dinner Alexei was probably enjoying with his family and couldn't help the hatred that seemed to ooze from her every pore. The nun who had cared for them in the orphanage had been very firm on raising them with religion, but not even the thought of God's wrath could soften Katie's heart for her employer. Alexei treated them like dirt, like the scum of the earth, all the while building a mountain of gold on their backs. Had she had anywhere else to go, she would have escaped a long time ago, but she had nowhere. There were many men like Alexei who barely paid their employees their worth. All they cared about was production and turnover. Heaven forbid a worker came down with so much as a cold, the chances illness would also result in a red slip were well founded. It wasn't the life Katie had dreamed of. Often were the times when she felt like she did now, that she couldn't help but wonder about her parents. Why would they have left her on the doorstep of the orphanage when she was barely a few weeks old? Did they not love her? Was she not what they wanted? The feelings of rejection had faded over the years, but sometimes they came back and almost rendered Katie breathless with heartache. Another tear slipped over her cheek as she glanced up at the moldy roof. Lord, what have I done to deserve this life? How have I offended you or my parents to have earned the rejection of being forsaken? My dreams aren't big, Lord. I simply dream of a home and a warm plate of food on most nights. And yet I can't even seem to manage to earn enough even for that. How will I ever find a way out of this wretched life? Katie sighed and moved towards the bed. She wouldn't say her prayers of thanks tonight, because tonight she had nothing to be grateful for. She had an empty belly, a cold bed, and barely a few dimes to her name. It didn't matter how hard she prayed for her circumstances to change. It seemed as if God had forgotten her. She cried herself to sleep, knowing that no one would hear her or even care. As soon as sleep lulled her under, she dreamt of warm summers, bright yellow dresses, and a handsome man waving to her from a porch. Just looking at him, she could feel the love he felt for her. Tentatively, she moved towards the porch in her dream, drawn closer by the aroma of a home-cooked meal. The man smiled brightly at her, taking her hand as they moved together towards the front door. They were surrounded by nothing but nature, tall mountains and luscious green fields. She turned to the man and smiled under the watch of his warm brown eyes before opening the door. The scent of sweat, mold, and cold overpowered every sense. When she glanced around, a frown creased her brow when she recognized the frame asleep in the corner of the room. She recognized the raggedy bedding, and there was no denying the stench as she looked to the left to see Beatrix and the other workers, laboring as if their lives depended on it. Katie stepped back, trying to slam the door shut on reality, and returned to the pleasant dream, but the dream was gone. She woke up in a cold sweat, wondering about the meaning behind the dream. In that brief moment, all her dreams had come true until she had stepped through the door and into the cabin. Trying to catch her breath, her eyes darted about the dark room until they came to rest on the copy of the Matrimonial Times. Was God trying to tell her something? Unless she took the first step, she would always end up exactly where she was. Katie huffed and turned over in bed, trying to fall asleep again. In place of sleep, however, her thoughts drifted to the pleasantness of her dream. Chapter 3. On Sunday morning, when the sun's beams slanted through the grime-stained window, the light fell on the very thing Katie had been trying to ignore since last night's dream. She hadn't managed to fall asleep again, taunted instead by the warm feelings of love, acceptance, and safety until the early hours of the morning. She had finally rolled out of bed, knowing that sleep wouldn't come again. It was Sunday, her only day off every week, and although she wanted nothing more than a lie-in, followed by a nice hot breakfast. Her dream had spoiled the first, and her budget disallowed the second. After making her bed and tidying the small apartment, she thought of Susan's letter again. What if Susan was right? What if her only chance at happiness was in the newspaper lying on the kitchen table? What if ignoring it for another minute meant ignoring her fate? The thought sent a chill running down her spine, but, try as she might to ignore it, Katie simply couldn't. She glanced around the tenement apartment and wondered about the choices available to her. She had no family who cared about her. Her only friend had moved halfway across the country in the hopes of finding love, and all that kept her in New York was her horrific job as a seamstress for a Polish man who didn't care if she starved as long as she helped produce 15 coats a day. A huff of indignation escaped her as she snatched the newspaper off the table and carried it to her bed. "I'm only looking," she promised herself as she turned to the first page. As she scanned the numerous advertisements from men hoping to find wives, she couldn't help but wonder what she should look for. She had never sought a husband or a romantic relationship for that matter, so she had no idea of her preferences or even if she had any. After reading through 2 pages of advertisements, Katie was almost certain this wasn't the answer to her problems. She pulled on her coat, noticing it was a balmy day. Knowing that winter was already lurking, she decided to take a walk to clear her mind. At the last moment, she grabbed the newspaper and tucked it under her arm. Instead of walking through 5 points as she usually would, Katie found herself drawn to the richer neighborhoods of the Upper East Side. It was common for her to walk this way on Sundays, to allow herself to dream of a better life before she jumped into the rat race of work and hunger again on Monday morning. Beautiful horse-drawn coaches passed her on the street, their wheels spattering her with murky water, reminding her of her place in life. But Katie promised herself that wouldn't always be the case. After an hour, she found a bench amongst the beautiful brownstone houses and sat down to rest her legs. The paper pressed against her chest, reminding her of its presence. Having nothing better to do, she pulled it out and continued reading. It wasn't until the very last page that a certain gentleman's advertisement caught her eye. Unlike the other advertisements that boasted wealth and riches, this man offered only a humble life on a ranch. Her brow furrowed as she read over it again. Rancher-seeking wife Jasper Wilkinson is a man of able means. He lives on a vast property in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, where he makes a living from cattle ranching. A tall man, described as handsome by some, not only has an even-tempered disposition, but a love for the land that is contagious. Surrounded by rugged mountains and ailed by hard, cold winters, only the beauty that it provides rivals this hard life. Jasper is seeking a wife able to cope with the hard work a ranch requires, along with the challenges that come with prairie living. Mostly dependent on the land for everything, Jasper promises that it is a life more rewarding than most. He is seeking a kind, gentle-hearted woman who will be able to face the challenges of this life of solitude. A woman not afraid to get her hands dirty, and one who would take kindly to his elderly mother with whom he shares his home. If you feel that you can cope with the rugged lifestyle Jasper can offer, he assures his wife will be sheltered, fed, and cherished. Jasper is looking forward to hearing from women from all corners of the country, but promises only to respond to one lucky lady. Katie's heart skipped a beat as she read over the advertisement a third time. Whereas all the other advertisements spoke of love and soulmates, Jasper didn't turn corners about what she would find in Colorado. His advertisement was honest, and something about that was endearing to Katie. She had dreamed so many dreams where wealth, riches, and comfort lured her in, and it was time she admitted that just perhaps they would never be within her reach. She closed the newspaper on her lap, but not on Jasper. Her mind kept churning over the words of his advertisement. Nowhere did he mention a romantically inclined relationship or raising children, which Katie couldn't help but appreciate. Having been raised in an orphanage, having a family of her own had never been her priority. She had spent most of her youth taking care of the younger children and knew how hard and exhausting children could be. Whereas most of the men mentioned being eager to start families, Jasper didn't, which was another point in his favor. Katy drew in a deep breath, and the filthy scent of mud and manure filled her senses. What would it be like to be surrounded by fresh mountain air? Her curiosity was piqued, and no matter how hard she tried to push Jasper from her mind, she couldn't help but wonder if this wasn't the one chance she had of leaving New York. A chance to live in the open air, a chance to escape the misery of working for Alexei, and more than anything, a chance of perhaps finding someone who would care for her. She wasn't foolish enough to think that a love match could come from answering an advertisement, but it was time to put her childish dreams aside and think of the future. A woman walked past her, and Katy couldn't help but recognize the coat she wore as one of Alexei's lines. She swallowed past the lump in her throat, realizing she would always just be the girl who made the coats, but she would never be the girl who wore them. To be honest, it wasn't even the coat that bothered her. It was the entire lifestyle suggested by the coat. The woman wearing the coat would be going home to a beautiful brownstone, no doubt. There would be a hot meal waiting for her, and she would enjoy it, knowing there would be another tomorrow. She wouldn't have to go to bed cold and hungry because she could afford the coal to run the furnace all day. She could sleep until she woke without being concerned about how many hours she would be stuck in a row house the following day to earn a bare minimum wage. When the woman turned and glanced at Katy as if she was lost or out of place, Katy couldn't help but admit she was both. She felt lost because she didn't know what to do, and she felt out of place because sitting on a bench among the beautiful brownstones of the Upper East Side would never be her place. She got up and gathered her newspaper before heading back to the tenement apartment. But on the way, she stopped by a mercantile store and bought a sheet of writing paper, a pen, and an envelope. She might not have enough left for a decent meal, but maybe writing a letter to Jasper Wilkinson would bring her a lifetime of meals. With a skip in her step and hope blooming in her chest, Katy headed home. She had a letter to write. Procida replent. Although she doubted she would be the one woman to whom Jasper replied, she had to at least take a chance. Colorado Springs, 29th of November, 1881. Jasper Wilkinson stepped out of the warmth of the two-story cabin and onto the cold porch. Around him was a white blanket that stretched as far as the eye could see. Here and there, something had been caught beneath its embrace, either a tree or a fallen log and even outcrops of rock. But the blanket would hold. Jasper knew that because for the last 28 winters, once the blanket fell in November, it would hold until February. With the white blanket came fluffy clouds that would rejuvenate it almost every other day, and the frosty breath of wind that the mountains exhaled into its valleys. It was the kind of cold that crept into your bones, seeping into every nerve ending to remind you that this landscape wasn't for the weak. Just like the cold and ruthless winters that brought awe to the men who called themselves ranchers, the summers would bring lush fields fresh with feed for their herds. Like most ranchers, Jasper brought his cattle down from the mountain in winter. He quickly learned that a frozen cow would cost his bottom line. He kept them close to the homestead where he could keep an eye on them, where he could feed them if they tired of digging through the snow for whatever fall had left behind. It was a hard life, but Jasper wouldn't want any other. His father, William H. Wilkinson, had bought the ranch shortly after the war. He had brought his wife and son out, and together they had built a life on the range. Jasper could still remember the 10 head of cattle his father had started with, and often wondered what his father would say about the herd of 500 he now had. He would be proud, Jasper reasoned, and he would be disappointed he wasn't able to witness it himself. His father had lived a tough life, fighting in the war, before seeking a piece of rugged land to call home. Nature had taken him just as it had given him his freedom. His father had died 10 years ago, peacefully in his sleep with a smile on his face. The doctor said his heart had failed, but Jasper reasoned his father's body had failed him because a stronger soul he had yet to meet. He glanced over his shoulder through the window and saw his mother sitting by the fire. The large stone fireplace had been a labor of love, Jasper and his father had built when Jasper was only 14. Many stories had been told around that fireplace, and many memories had been formed, some now harder and more painful to remember than others. Jasper drew in a deep breath of the frosty air before he pulled the letter out of his pocket. Some might have called him desperate to place an advertisement for a mail-order bride, but they weren't in his shoes. Living on a ranch 20 miles from the closest town was hard enough, but even more lonely somehow if you only had your mother for company. Once there had been someone who had made the ranch more bearable. Darlene had happened upon him one day in town, and from the first moment Jasper and she had looked upon each other, he had known Darlene was the woman with whom he wanted to share his life. For 2 years they had spent every moment of every day together. They had made a life for themselves, and they had shared it with his mother. For a short while, Jasper didn't even notice the challenge of ranching because he had Darlene to come home to every night. When she passed away in July, Jasper had thought his world had come to an end. For a month, he had mourned, cursing the heavens for taking her home. The next month, he had been in denial, wishing it had all been a bad dream. It was during the third month, in August, that Jasper realized he couldn't go on alone. He needed someone by his side. He had contacted the offices of the Matrimonial Times with a brief description of himself, inquiring if they would be interested in placing his advertisement. 7 Po. But before he received a reply from their offices, he received a letter from Katie. Her heartfelt honesty in that first letter had spoken to Jasper on a level he still didn't understand. He loved Darlene, but he missed the company. He missed having someone to share his day with. And most of all, he missed having a friend. It had taken him 3 days to gather the courage to write back to her. His letter had been short, once again stating he was looking for companionship and making no reference to love because, deep down, Jasper knew love wouldn't be on the cards for him again. He needed a woman to help him. He needed someone to lean on. He needed someone kind enough but strong enough to dare to live on his ranch. His mother was wonderful, truly an angel, but at the age of 68, Letty was beginning to show her years. Her once jet-black hair had faded to glossy silver. Her dark brown eyes now seemed hollow, as if she was merely waiting for the day she too was called to heaven. Jasper knew it wouldn't be long before his mother succumbed to age, especially with her cough since the start of winter. He wasn't sure if he wanted to love again, but he knew he needed a wife. He opened Katie's letter, and a smile curved his mouth. They had been corresponding for 2 months now, and every time he received a letter from her, he couldn't help but be a little more eager to meet her. She seemed fierce and loyal, and if he read carefully between the lines, desperate to leave her life in New York. Chapter 5. The Transcontinental Railway, 2nd January 1882. No surprise could have been better for Katie than receiving the wedding proposal in the mail. Katie had leaped, cried out with joy, and then cried real tears when she received Jasper's letter. Over the last few months, she had lived for his letters and the letters to Susan. Susan's letters gave her hope, and Jasper's letters made her realize that hope might just lead to dreams coming true. Although there had been no mention of love from either herself or Jasper, Katie didn't need it to accept the train fare he had sent with his proposal. She had come to know Jasper as a kind and generous man, and right now, considering herself his friend was enough motivation for her to leave her dreary life in New York. She hadn't even bothered to go to the row house to tell Alexei of her decision. Instead, she had sold everything she owned and used the money along with her savings to buy a new coat and a dress for her journey west. Katie had replied to Jasper's letter, accepting his proposal and notifying him of her expected time of arrival for her to be collected from the platform in Colorado Springs. She was excited and mortified at leaving the familiar behind, but as the train pulled out of the station in New York, Katie reminded herself she was leaving only hardship and despair. She might not know Colorado or be able to brave the harsh winter that Jasper had described in his last letter, but she did know if she didn't at least try, she would regret it for the rest of her life. Over the last 3 days, she had seen numerous passengers come and go. Some only rode the train to the next town, and others, like the mother with two little girls who had been sitting across from her since New York, were also headed west. There was a strange atmosphere on the train. Almost hopeful, although you could sense the fear as well. Apart from the big-mouthed crew of men riding in the back, no one else had been to the west before. Katie didn't know what to expect over the next hill or even the name of the next town, but that didn't diminish her courage in the least. She watched the changing landscape, reading Jasper's letters as an affirmation of the life that awaited her. Now and then she would sigh inwardly when one of the young girls wept inconsolably, and she would once again be grateful for her decision not to have children and the fact that Jasper's letters never mentioned procreation. It wasn't that she didn't like children. She had simply spent too much of her life looking out for others, and now was the time to look out for herself. On a different train of thought, one that she pushed to the back of her mind, she presumed people to be selfish for having children. She understood the need to procreate and to leave a legacy, but why bother at all if that legacy would only face a hard life of suffering? The train's whistle sounded, alerting its passengers of the next stop. Curious, as she was with every stop, Katie sat upright and peered out over the small town. As was the case with most of the towns they had passed through, a few cabins lined a thoroughfare with a sign either for a saloon or a boarding house. The further the train traveled westward, the smaller the towns became, and the more rugged the passengers who boarded at every stop. The conductor began making his way through the carriages, calling out the stop and announcing a brief interlude to restock their coal supplies. "Mother, can we please get off? Just for a short while," the eldest little girl complained. Katie could see the wary defeat on their mother's face. "Just a short while. We can't miss the train if it leaves," the mother said, gathering her reticule before following her girls off the train. For a moment, Katie considered disembarking too, before deciding against it. She didn't need anything and had no desire to walk through a dusty town. She gazed out the window as wagons of coal were loaded onto the train before her eye caught the mother with her two little girls. They had barely left the platform when 4 men approached them. Their rotten-toothed smiles and leery looks made the hairs stand up on the back of Katie's neck. She waited for a moment to see whether the mother would rush back to the safety of the train. The moment she reached out for her daughter's hands, however, a man stepped in front of them, blocking their way. Before Katie knew it, she was out of her seat and rushing towards the mother and her daughters. The warm wind slapped her cheeks and tugged at her hair as she disembarked the train. She could hear the woman begging for the men to leave them alone, garnering nothing more than lascivious grins. Katie had spent enough time in the back streets of 5 Points to know these men didn't have chivalry on their minds. She pushed her way through the small crowd on the platform, making her way to the woman's side. "Is something the matter?" "Look-a-here, she got a friend," one of the men called out. Even from a distance, Katie could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Let's get back to the train. It's about to leave," Katie lied, taking the one girl's hand. "Not so fast, pretty lady. We have a toll that needs to be paid." "No pretty lady gets off in our town without paying the toll," another man leered, moving closer. Katie knew she was taking a chance, but she couldn't stand by and let these men get away with whatever mischief they were up to. She stepped forward and summoned her most haughty look ever. "I'm sorry, sir, but do you know the mayor of Judson's Hall?" Katie grasped at the town's name as a last resort. "Mr. Purnham. Course we know of him. Why?" the man grunted. Katie smiled sweetly. "I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Purnham's niece. I am his sister, Fiona Purnham. I'm sure you'd agree that Mr. Purnham wouldn't take kindly to us being bothered so shortly after our arrival." The one man's brow shot up. "I ain't looking for no trouble, miss." He turned and rushed back to the saloon along with 2 of the men, but the other 3 remained. "Say, I don't recall Mr. Purnham having a niece," the one questioned, doubting Katie's fib. Katie laughed. "I don't recall Mr. Purnham mentioning he had such interesting friends. Come, Let's collect our bags before the train leaves with our luggage, she directed her attention to the mother. Before the man could argue any further, Katie took the girl's hand and began rushing for the train with the mother short on her heels. As soon as they were on board, the whistle sounded, and the train began to move. Katie breathed a sigh of relief, even as the woman and her two daughters watched, wide-eyed. You? You lied to them, the woman said, almost disbelieving that the lie had worked. Katie chuckled. At least it worked. Best stay on the train at the next stop, yes? Katie aimed the question at the two little girls, who immediately bobbed their heads up and down. We're forever grateful to you. Why? I can't imagine the trouble we might have found ourselves in. I'm Louise Akeridge, and these are my daughters, Mary and Rachel. It's a pleasure to meet you, Louise. I'm Katie Mayfield. Miss Mayfield, we truly owe you for your quick thinking. Katie smiled as she took her seat. She had never been grateful for being raised on the streets of 5 Points, but at that moment, she couldn't be more grateful that she'd learned early on that power and money scared off most thugs. She might not be what Jasper Wilkinson expected her to be, but at least she filled one part of his criteria. She could be tough when tough was what was called for. Chapter 6. Colorado Springs, 10th of January, 1882. After saying goodbye to Louise and her daughters the day before, Katie was anxious to get to Colorado Springs. She had spent a little more than a week on the train and wanted nothing more than a good soak and a proper night's rest. As the train slowed toward its next stop in Colorado Springs, Katie was still overwhelmed by the beautiful mountains that surrounded it. A thick layer of snow lay on the ground, so thick it seemed as if one could bounce on it and pretend it was clouds. Although she was cold despite her new coat, it was the most beautiful sight she'd ever seen. It was only when the train's whistle sounded, announcing its arrival, that Katie realized she was about to meet her future husband. She thought of all the letters they had shared and everything he had told her about living on a ranch. A nervous flutter erupted in her stomach, even as the conductor announced the stop. She couldn't help but feel a little anxious as she collected her carpet bag from the overhead storage before slipping her reticule over her arm. This was it, she thought. There was no turning back now, and even if she wanted to, she was in much the same situation as Susan had been all those months before. She didn't even have the money for a return fare. There was only one option now, and that was to get off the train and hope Mr. Jasper Wilkinson hadn't forgotten that she was arriving today. The cold wind stung her cheeks as soon as she stepped off the train. People were standing all about, waiting for their loved ones to disembark, but Katie didn't even notice them as her eyes darted around for a man fitting Jasper's description. The town wasn't large, but it was bigger than some of the smaller towns in which the train had stopped during her journey. Not only did it boast a saloon, a boarding house, and a sheriff's office, but also a doctor's surgery, a garment store, and a Chinese healer. Intrigued and fascinated by the small town, she carefully made her way through the crowd to the edge of the platform. She glanced around without seeing a man fitting Jasper's description. Fear clutched at her heart, wondering if he had forgotten her. She didn't even have enough money to rent a room in the boarding house for the night. "Excuse me, ma'am, might you be Miss Catherine Mayfield?" The deep voice behind her sent chills down her spine. Katie summoned a smile and turned around, only to be faced with a solid chest. Her eyes slowly traveled up to meet his face. He had a square jaw that was stubbled with a day's growth. His lips were thin, but she couldn't help but wonder if they would seem softer if he smiled. He had a regal nose, almost giving him an air of authority. But it was his eyes that caught her breath. They were the lightest shade of brown she'd ever seen. On the left, where the sun snuck below the rim of his hat, they had nuances of pale green at the center. Right now, those fascinating eyes were perusing her as well. Katie took a step back, feeling flustered as a blush colored her cheeks. She hadn't known what to expect when she finally met Jasper Wilkinson, but she hadn't expected him to be the most handsome man she'd ever laid eyes on. She had also not expected her heart to skip into a racing beat. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Wilkinson." Katie stammered through the words. uncertain of the protocol for meeting a husband-to-be for the first time. The one corner of his mouth tilted into a grin. "It's a pleasure to meet you, too." "Please call me Jasper." Katie nodded. "You may call me Katie. All my friends do." As soon as the words slipped out of her mouth, she realized this man wasn't going to be her friend. He was to be her husband, and she barely knew him. He reached for her hand, and the moment their hands touched, Katie felt a zing travel up her arm, causing her to feel a little lightheaded. "Let me take your bag. Should we collect your other luggage?" Jasper asked, glancing towards the conductor who was taking charge of offloading the luggage. "No," Katie said, feeling a blush color her cheeks again. She could only hope Jasper thought it was the cold. "This is all." Jasper frowned but didn't question her. Instead, he smiled and nodded. "Then I suppose we can get a move on." Katie followed him to a wagon waiting on one side of the platform. He placed the carpet bag in the back before helping Katie onto the seat. Jasper took up the reins and kept his eyes on the thoroughfare as they rode into town. Katie would steal a glance in his direction every so often, feeling her heart skip a beat whenever she did. She might have come to Colorado Springs hoping for a better life, but now that she'd met her husband, she couldn't help but hope for love as well. "How was your journey?" Jasper smiled at her briefly. "Long." Katie chuckled before shaking her head. "I never realized how far Colorado was from New York. Have you ever been?" Jasper shook his head. "Nope, never had a need to be anywhere but right here. Say, I know we just met and all, but I've arranged with the preacher to wed us before heading back to the ranch. That all right with you?" Katie's eyes shot open wide. "You mean get married now?" Jasper shrugged apologetically. "I didn't think it would be proper to take you to the ranch otherwise." Katie wanted to point out that his mother could chaperone them, but as she searched his gaze, she knew she didn't mind. She wanted to be married to this handsome man. Although she didn't know him at all, he was her reason for traveling to Colorado Springs in the first place. She drew in a deep breath and summoned a smile. That would be perfectly dandy. Jasper breathed a sigh of relief before smiling at her in a way that made her heart skip a beat. Chapter 7, Colorado Springs, 10th of January, 1882. In the days since receiving the letter from Catherine, accepting his proposal, Jasper couldn't help but feel a little nervous about the pending arrival of his new wife. He wasn't looking for a romantic connection, but more of a companion. Suddenly, he couldn't fathom why he had thought that courting a perfect stranger would be the answer to his problems. But the moment he watched her disembark from the train, he knew that he had gotten more than he bargained for. Never had he asked Catherine, or Katie, as she preferred to be called, about her appearance. It hadn't mattered to John in the least. But to see her beautiful butter-colored curls framing her sweet face and those large cornflower blue eyes searching the platform had simply taken his breath away. He might not have hoped for romance, but Catherine Mayfield caught his eye the moment he first saw her. He glanced cautiously her way as he stopped in front of the church. The building was the latest addition to the town's thoroughfare, and although it was too far from the ranch for Jasper to attend Sunday services, he couldn't be more grateful that the preacher was willing to wed them today. Jasper had a feeling that if he didn't claim Katie as his wife, she might well be scooped up within days by one of the other single gentlemen in town. He helped her from the wagon and smiled at her. When she returned his smile, a small niggle of guilt began to creep up on Jasper. He shoved the guilt aside and met Katie's gaze. "Sure you're ready to become Mrs. Wilkinson?" Katie nodded. "It's now or never, right?" Jasper laughed. "Right." He slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow and led her into the church where the pastor was waiting for them with a bored look. "Did she say yes?" Jasper nodded. She did indeed. The preacher didn't waste words or time, for that matter. The sermon was barely more than a passage from the Bible about respecting and cherishing each other. This was quickly followed by pronouncing them husband and wife. Jasper couldn't help but feel as if he had just tricked Katie, but he couldn't think about that now. She had come to Colorado Springs for a better life, and regardless of anything else, Jasper knew he could give her that. She would have her own room and the vast open spaces of the ranch, and she would never want for food or clothing ever again. Now he just had to hope that was enough to keep her on the ranch. As they walked back to the wagon, Jasper was caught off guard when he thought back on Darlene and their wedding day. On that day, it hadn't been about convenience, loneliness, or even offering someone a better life. It had only been about love. Jasper had been head over heels in love with Darlene, and he had to believe that she had felt the same about him. He had seen her love for him whenever she turned her emerald green eyes on him. He glanced at Katie and knew that he didn't feel the same way about her, but hoped that in time they could at least become friends. It was a lonely life out on the prairie, and a man needed company of the softer kind. He had already prepared her a room and had his mother make up the bed with fresh linen. There was a feast of a meal waiting for her at the ranch, and his mother couldn't wait to meet her new daughter-in-law. Jasper expected to feel guilty about moving on now that Darlene had passed on, but whenever Katie didn't know he was looking, he noticed almost a relieved look in her gaze, as if she could relax for the first time in years. How could he feel guilty for proposing to a woman who had been living on the edge her entire life? "How far is the ranch?" Katie asked a while after they left town. Jasper shrugged. "About 3 hours more." She nodded and crossed her arms across her waist before Jasper noticed her shiver. A grin tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Not used to the cold?" Katie shook her head. "I'm used to the cold. New York winters can be just as dreadful. It's just, I've been on a train for over a week. I think I need to get used to the cold again." Without even considering, Jasper shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "That should keep ya. Ma ought to have the fire stoked and the cabin warm when we arrive." When Katie smiled at him gratefully before wrapping the coat tighter around her shoulders, Jasper felt his heart skip a beat. He wasn't looking for love, he reminded himself, especially not barely 6 months after his wife's passing, but something about Catherine Mayfield reminded him what it felt like to be in love. Chapter 8. Colorado Springs, 10th of January, 1882. Katie couldn't help but feel as if Jasper was hiding something as they neared the ranch. She asked him questions about his life on the ranch, his mother, and how he spent his time, and although he answered most questions, it felt as if he was evading the easiest of the questions. She had asked if he'd ever been in love, and he quickly glanced at her before changing the subject. Katie tried not to ponder on it too much. After all, they barely knew each other. She couldn't blame him for not wanting to divulge his entire past to her only a couple of hours after their meeting. But they were already married, she reminded herself with a frown. "There it is," Jasper said, turning to her with a grin as he brought the wagon to a stop. Katie glanced in the direction in which he pointed and couldn't help but feel a smile curve her mouth. They had ridden for 4 hours, and finally, in the distance on a small hill at the foothills of the Rockies, she could see a cabin with a barn beside it. It was beautiful. She could only imagine the view of the mountains from the porch. Surrounding the cabin were large open fields, all covered in snow but dotted with cattle. Having come from New York, Katie had never seen a cow up close before, and suddenly she could not wait to see one. "Will you show me your cattle?" Jasper chuckled. "They're always around. You'll see them often enough." For the last 10 minutes of the journey, Katie couldn't help but feel as if she had just struck gold. The area was breathtaking. The cabin was almost 5 times the size of her tenement apartment, and the man by her side was more handsome than any man she had ever passed on the street in New York. He wasn't refined, wearing a suit, jacket, undercoat, and bow tie, but something about his worn jacket, chaps, and narrowed gaze made her feel safer than she had ever felt in her entire life. Jasper stopped the wagon in front of the barn and moved around it to help Katie down. When she turned around, it was to find an elderly lady standing on the porch waving to her with a broad smile. Katie couldn't remember feeling so welcomed in her entire life. Even at the orphanage, the matron had been eager to see her leave. Her heart clenched in her chest as she bit the tears back before approaching the elderly lady. "Hello, my name is Catherine Mayfield." Katie introduced, holding out her hand. Instead of shaking it, the lady covered it with both of hers. Catherine, you're so very welcome. You're a blessing to Jasper and me. To be willing to raise another woman's son, it takes courage and heart. Katie's smile didn't waver as she turned to Jasper. Perhaps he failed to mention his mother was a little dotty. Ma, let Katie settle in first, Jasper said, shuffling in place as if nervous. Katie, this is my ma, Elizabeth Wilkinson, although she goes by Letty. Katie smiled, still wondering what Jasper meant by letting her settle in first, when suddenly the air was pierced by the shrill cries of a baby. The sound startled Katie at first, before it began to grate on her nerves. She watched as a look passed between Jasper and his mother before Jasper turned to Katie with an apologetic look. I'll be right back. Katie wasn't sure if she should attempt to run back to town or demand to know what was going on. But when Jasper returned with a baby in his arms, all she could do was stare. Had she just married a bigamist? She had known that courting a man through letters was a foolish pursuit, but she never imagined it to be this foolish. Jasper moved towards her with an apologetic grin. Katie, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Darla Wilkinson. She's only 7 months old, but she's a handful. Prosody. Liesting. Katie looked at the cherub-faced baby girl who was smiling at her, revealing 2 front teeth. Her eyes were the same brown as her father's, and golden tufts of hair were scattered on her head. Katie took a step back and began shaking her head before she met Jasper's gaze again. Where's Darla's mother? Letty sighed heavily, shaking her head before she knocked her son lightly on the arm. You didn't tell her. Jasper, how could you not tell her? Katie felt her hackles begin to rise as she turned to Letty. What didn't he tell me? Letty sighed and reached for her granddaughter. Once she had Darla in her arms, she turned to Jasper with a disappointed look. You've got some explaining to do, and you best do it now. Letty turned to Katie and shook her head. I'm sorry, Katie. I thought I'd raised him better. Letty disappeared into the cabin with the baby, leaving Katie and Jasper on the porch. Katie wanted nothing more than to step out of the cold, but that could wait. Before she took another step into Jasper's life, she wanted to know what he hadn't told her and why he had a daughter he failed to mention. I'm listening, Katie said, crossing her arms and already wondering how she was going to manage to find the money to cover the train fare back to New York. Jasper took off his hat, and for the first time, Katie saw the thickness of his head of dark black hair. Katie, I'm sorry. I should have mentioned Darla. I was just afraid if I said anything, you wouldn't come. So you're not looking for a companion? You're looking for a caretaker for your daughter. The words were laced with anger, but Katie couldn't seem to stop them. Jasper shrugged. I didn't lie about companionship. I promise that I didn't lie about that. It's lonely out here. He trailed off and glanced off into the distance before taking a seat on the top step of the porch. When I met Darlene, it was love at first sight. I didn't think I could be happier than I was with her. We were overjoyed to have our first child, the birth. Not even Ma could help her. Everything happened so quickly, and before we knew something had gone wrong, the baby was born and Darlene was gone. Katie's heart clenched when his voice broke, but she couldn't let herself be dragged into his woes. She didn't even want children, and now she'd been trapped into raising another woman's daughter. I'm sorry, I can't do this, Jasper nodded. I can't blame you. It's just, Ma is getting up there in years. She struggles to keep up with the baby. I know nothing about raising a baby. I just hope that once you met her, never mind, it doesn't matter. You're right, it doesn't matter. I think I should go back to New York, Katie said with a sigh. Jasper searched her face and waited a few seconds before he finally spoke. Katie, correct me if I'm wrong, but what do you want to go back to? You don't have a family. You worked long hours for meager wages, and you were all but starving and living in a moldy tenement apartment. For the first time, Katie regretted being too honest in her letters. He knew more about her than she wanted him to, and the worst was that he was right. I don't know anything about raising children. Jasper, I haven't even considered having children of my own. I was raised in an orphanage. They're nothing but trouble. When they're your own, they're nothing but pleasure, Jasper attempted with a hopeful smile. Katie huffed. But she's not mine. Jasper flinched. I know, I'm sorry. Look, I can offer you a home, 3 meals a day, and a life you never would have had in New York. I know you weren't seeking love, but rather sanctuary. Why don't we just try? You're welcome to anything I own, and in exchange, I'll appreciate it if you can help Ma with Darla. I don't expect you to raise her, Katie. I just need a little help. Between the cattle and the ranch, I don't want Ma to know, but I can't leave Darla alone with her. What if something happens to Ma? Katie clenched her teeth, knowing he had a point. She had nowhere to go, and helping him with his daughter was a small price to pay for 3 meals a day and a room that didn't reek of mold. This might not be what she signed up for, but at the moment, it was the best option she had. You've been a widower for 7 months, then? Katie asked with a narrowed look. Now she suddenly understood why he didn't mention love or romance in his letters. Are you still mourning your wife? Jasper sighed. I think I'll always mourn her in a way, but I've realized that Darla needs me, and that's what keeps me going. Katie shook her head. I need to think about this. She turned on her heel and headed towards the snow-covered fields. Behind her, she heard Jasper puff out a sigh of frustration, but she couldn't be worried about that now. He had lied to her. He had lured her here under false pretenses, and now she had little choice but to stay. She glanced at the cabin over her shoulder and shook her head as a tear slipped out. She should have known that just like anything else in her life, Jasper was too good to be true. Chapter 9. It took about 10 minutes for Katie to realize that she couldn't wander around the unknown snowy landscape forever. The sun was setting, and it was growing even colder. It didn't matter how angry she was or how betrayed she felt, she had no choice but to head to Jasper's cabin. As she made her way back, she realized what bothered her most wasn't that he'd lied, but that she really liked him. She didn't want to like a man who had fooled her into coming to him only to take care of his daughter. For a brief moment after she met him, she had dreamed of falling in love. Learning as she had that he was still mourning his deceased wife meant all chances of that were now gone. She opened the door to the cabin and stepped into its welcoming warmth. As soon as she closed the door behind her, she noticed Letty's apologetic expression as she sat by the fireside holding the baby. Jasper was in the kitchen making coffee. He held the coffee pot mid-air as he met her gaze. Katie felt the familiar flutter of attraction and quickly looked away. If it's not too much trouble, I'd like to take a bath. Jasper set down the coffee pot and nodded. Come, I'll show you to your room. Katie smiled at Letty before she followed Jasper down the hall. He stopped in front of a room and held her gaze for a moment. I'm sorry I lied to you. Would you like me to take you back to town tomorrow? Katie almost said yes, but she realized that he was right. Going back wouldn't solve anything. I'll stay for now. It wasn't a promise of forever, but it was at least a commitment until she could think of a better plan. Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much, Jasper said, opening the door. Katie stepped into the room and was surprised by the scent of lavender. The bed was neatly made, but it was the tub at the foot of the bed that caught her eye. Steam rose from the water that filled it to the brim. Dried lavender blossoms drifted on the water, filling the air with its heavenly scent. Katie's heart swelled in her chest at his kindness. Regardless of her anger, he had filled a tub for her and even added the lavender. You did this? Jasper shrugged. Thought you might want to take a soak in the tub tonight. I know Darlene liked lavender in her bath. I'm sorry, if you'd rather I remove them. Katie smiled at his thoughtfulness. She could see this was new territory for them both. Jasper had been married before, and she had never shared her living space with anyone since leaving the orphanage. It might not be the marriage she imagined, but she had to admit that there was something to be said for a man who knew what a woman preferred. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Jasper said softly, holding her gaze. His voice was deep, scraping over every nerve ending of her body. Katie didn't want to like him or to be attracted to him, but she was quickly realizing she had little choice. Jasper smiled before turning away and leaving her to bathe. Katie turned to see her carpet bag on a chair by the window and let out a sigh. He might not be the single bachelor she had in mind, but he was kind and considerate. That had to count for something. A glance at the bed and the lantern on the nightstand made her heart swell a little more, because although she wasn't happy about learning she had been lured to Colorado to be a nursemaid, she was more than grateful for a warm bed, a clean room, and a hot bath, none of which she'd had in a very long time. After soaking for almost half an hour, Katie dressed in clean clothes and braided her hair neatly before heading to the kitchen. Letty was stirring the stew on the stove, the rich aroma filling the air. But it was Jasper who brought a smile to her face. He was sitting with his back to her, with Darla on his lap. He bounced the baby and blew raspberries on her tummy, making the baby girl giggle with pure joy. Katie couldn't help but laugh when Darla's voice reached a fever pitch of giddiness. She turned to find Letty watching her and quickly composed herself. "They're easy to fall in love with," Letty muttered with a hint of a smile. Katie frowned and quickly shook her head. "I've never been fond of children. I'm sure that won't be a problem." Although she had a feeling Letty was right. The man on his own was already a threat to her heart, but to see him soften as he played with his little girl, it was hard not to want to be a part of their joy. "Can I set the table for you, Letty?" Letty grinned, shaking her head. "If you'd rather set the table than play with Darla, I'd appreciate it. Plates are over there, silverware in that drawer, and you might even be happy to find some napkins there." Katie glanced around the kitchen and quickly found everything she needed. Once the table was set, Jasper joined them with Darla on his hip. Katie took a moment to glance at the baby and found the little girl watching her in fascination. Katie didn't respond or look away, but she couldn't help but admit that Darla was as cute as a button and clearly the apple of her father's eye. Chapter 10. Colorado Springs, 12th of January, 1882. 2 days after Katie's arrival, Jasper still couldn't shake his guilt. It was clear as daylight to both him and his mother that Katie didn't like children, babies, or Darla for that matter. When asked, she would hold Darla for a minute or change her diaper without complaint, but it was clear she didn't enjoy interacting with the baby at all. Jasper was out in the field, checking the cattle for injuries or frostbite after the night's snowfall, and couldn't seem to stop thinking about his new wife. He had only placed the advertisement because he needed someone to help with Darla. Although his mother insisted she'd manage, Jasper knew his mother couldn't keep up with a baby anymore. It wouldn't be fair of him to place that responsibility on his mother's shoulders. He hadn't felt guilty about lying to Katie in the letters, especially after learning that she led a horrible life in New York. He had somehow reasoned that his lies didn't matter because he was offering her a better life. He didn't think of romance or even being a real husband again. All he had thought of was luring her to Colorado Springs and proving that he could offer her a better life than the one she had. The only problem was that Jasper hadn't imagined he'd like her. He also had not imagined that she wouldn't like Darla. What was there not to like about a cute baby girl? But then he figured he couldn't blame Katie. Perhaps she did like Darla, but was just too angry with Jasper to let her affection for the little girl show. But the real problem was, Jasper reasoned as he checked on a pregnant heifer that he liked Katie more than he ever figured he would. He couldn't help but admire a woman who had been raised in an orphanage and worked for years as something only a step above a slave, to still have some fight left in her. He had mentioned that he needed a tough woman to join him on the ranch, and she didn't disappoint. He didn't realize she'd be beautiful and stubborn, and have a way of looking at him that reminded him what it felt like to be a husband again. Whenever he was near Katie, he was reminded of the lies he had told her. He had apologized several times since her arrival, and yet she didn't seem to have forgiven him. She had said she would stay for the moment, but Jasper couldn't help but wonder how long that moment would be. Would she stay for a week and find a train home, or would she seek refuge in Colorado Springs? The thought of Katie leaving the ranch bothered him more than he imagined. Once he had checked on all the cattle, Jasper headed back to the cabin. A smile curved his mouth when he saw smoke curling from the chimney into the clear air. When was the last time he looked forward to returning to the cabin for lunch? He wondered, as he tied the horse to the post by the water trough. He stepped into the house and couldn't help but catch his breath at the sight before him. His mother was sitting in her usual chair by the fire, but a large blanket had been thrown on the floor. It was the one he had used for Katie's room. Katie sat in one corner, and his little girl was lying face down on the blanket. "You're going to suffocate her," Jasper said, rushing towards Darla. Just as he was about to scoop his baby girl up and chase Katie out of his cabin, his mother's firm voice made him stop. "Jasper, Katie is doing the right thing. She's helping Darla strengthen her back and neck. It's the only way she's going to learn how to crawl. Wait a minute and watch. She'll lift her head." Katie glanced at Jasper with a furrowed brow. "I might not like children, Jasper, but I've helped raise quite a few in the orphanage. Babies should be laid on their tummies a few times a day from the age of 4 months. Inhaling. Jasper felt thoroughly chastened. When Darla lifted her head, wobbled slightly on her neck, and looked at him with a drooling smile, he felt his heart clench in his chest. "I'm sorry. I thought—" Katie glared at him with derision. "I wouldn't hurt her." Katie stood up and walked to her room, letting the door slam behind her. Jasper was left with his mother's stern look. "First, you're unhappy because she doesn't care about Darla, and now, the first time she actively spends time with her, you accuse her of wanting to hurt her. Really, Jasper, I thought you'd be better at this." Jasper opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, his mother got up, clucked her tongue, and walked to her room. When the second door slammed in the hallway, Jasper let out a heavy sigh. He scooped Darla up and searched her eyes. "Your pa's making a mess of things, baby girl," Darla gurgled before a shrill cry escaped her. Jasper sighed and tried to pat her to calm down, but none of the women in his life were very eager to spend time with him today. For a moment, he couldn't help but wish he had never brought Katie here. Sure, he and his mother had struggled to juggle the ranch, the chores, and the baby, but now he was seemingly juggling 3 angry women and a ranch. He closed his eyes and sighed. "Dear Lord, I only wanted what was best for Darla. I know I might have gone about it the wrong way, Lord, but please help me fix this. I like Katie, and I can't imagine her hurting Darla, but when I saw Darla with her face in the blanket, forgive me, Lord. Please forgive me. Help me find a way to make things right. I don't expect Katie to ever love me, Lord, but at least let her find some happiness with us." He heard someone clear her throat behind him. Jasper turned to look into Katie's face. "It's all right. You didn't know what I was doing. Next time, just ask before you accuse me." Jasper nodded, surprised that Katie was the one offering the olive leaf. "I will, I'm sorry." He smiled wryly. "It seems those are the only words I managed to say in your presence." Katie didn't answer. Instead, she reached for Darla. "It's time for her to eat. That's why she's upset." He watched Katie move to the kitchen to feed his daughter the porridge she had already prepared. Jasper couldn't help but wonder if Katie's resistance to having children wasn't just a scar from her childhood. She was good with Darla, although she refused to admit it. Chapter 11. Colorado Springs, 16th of January, 1882. Almost a week after her arrival, Katie was no closer to finding a solution to her problem. She had nowhere to go, and unless she wanted to go back to New York to work for Alexei and spend her nights hungry and cold, this really was the best option. She had quickly become good friends with Letty. Letty's age might be showing in the way she moved and in the naps she took every afternoon, but when it came to her mind, she was sharp as a tack. As for Jasper, she maintained her distance. She wasn't sure if it was because of the anger or the way he made her feel whenever he was close. Katie had never been courted and had never been even slightly interested in a boy before, but whenever Jasper was close, it was as if she could feel him, as if her heart sensed he was there even before she realized it. His light brown eyes had a way of making her feel as if she had bared her soul. It felt unfair because she wished she could see into his soul as well. All she knew about the handsome man who was now her husband was that he was a rancher who had loved and lost and was now stuck with a 7-month-old baby. She didn't know what food he liked, which season he liked best, or even if he liked her. All she knew was that he had lured her here to take care of his daughter, and this morning she was struggling to do even that. Her reluctance to work with and have children had been cemented this morning. Darla had woken up in a mood and had been fussing all morning. She didn't want her porridge, she didn't want a cuddle, and if Katie put her down for more than 5 seconds, she tried to lift the roof off the cabin with her protests. The worst part of taking care of Darla was knowing that she was just an innocent victim in all of this. The poor little girl had no part in losing her mother or her father's betrayal. She was just another reason why Katie didn't want to have children of her own. Why have a child when you knew the life that awaited it would be hard? There would be difficult choices to make, dreams that would never be realized, and more importantly, there would never be the happiness you wished for. Her heart ached for the baby girl as she cried in her arms. Letty was sitting by the fire, rubbing her ankles that were aching from the cold. Jasper had left early that morning to check on the cattle and had yet to return. It was almost lunchtime, and Letty commented absent-mindedly that perhaps he had a heifer and calf, which would be the only explanation for his absence. Since Katie knew less than nothing about cattle, she didn't bother to argue. "Come, Darla, what's wrong, baby girl?" Katie crooned as she bounced the little girl up and down. Her legs were aching and her back protesting, but she didn't dare stop. Although Darla still cried, the decibels seemed to lower when she bounced her. "I don't know what's going on with her this morning," Letty said with concern from the couch. "If my bones weren't playing up with the weather, I would have taken her." Katie could see Letty was in pain and didn't want to bother her with the baby's fussing. "Don't worry, sooner or later she has to tire out," Katie said confidently. When the crying continued for another 30 minutes, Katie finally felt herself come close to tears. She wasn't made to be a mother. Maybe she skipped out on getting the nurturing gene, was all she could figure as the baby kept up her crying. Katie brushed away Darla's tears. "Come on, honey. You need to stop crying, or I'm going to cry as well," Katie pleaded, feeling that she was coming close to the end of her rope. She sat down for a moment, but before she could even bounce the baby on her knee, Darla piped up louder than ever before. Tears burned Katie's eyes, and she couldn't stop the feeling of failure. She stood up and gently placed the bawling baby in her crib before rushing down the hall to her bedroom. The door slammed shut, and she threw herself on the bed, wailing just as loudly as the baby. Why had she come out here? What did she think would happen? That she would find love and happiness like Susan had? Who had she been kidding? What happened to Susan was the exception, not the rule. She had chased a pipe dream, and now she had everything she ever dreamed of. A warm house, a bed, food, and someone to protect her, and she couldn't even manage to soothe the baby. The door creaked open, and she quickly brushed away the tears. "I'll be right there, I promise." Letty sat down beside her on the bed and rubbed her back. "Take your time. I can't imagine how hard it must be for you. New mothers learn with their babies what's expected of them." "You were thrown in the deep end," Katie sniffed. "I'm drowning, aren't I?" Letty chuckled softly. "You're doing better than most. I remember once Jasper cried so much I gave him to his pa and told him I didn't want him back." "You did that?" Katie asked in surprise, wiping at her tears. Letty seemed like the ultimate mother. "Of course I did. Raising children is not easy, Katie, especially not when they can't tell you what's ailing them. I know you've tried everything I would have to soothe her this morning. She's just fussing, and I'm not even sure she knows why. She'll tire herself out sooner or later if left in the crib. I can't just leave her there. Jasper will kill me." "You won't leave her there. You'll stay close by. You can't take care of her if you don't take care of yourself. I'll keep an eye on her. You take a few minutes first." Men don't understand how emotionally exhausting a baby can be at times. Katie looked at Letty with new eyes. She had thought Letty was judging her from her seat the whole morning, while she had in fact been watching her with quiet approval. For the first time since she arrived in Colorado Springs, she felt as if there was hope after all. "I'll be right out." "Take your time." Letty smiled before leaving the room. Katie took a few deep breaths, feeling her strength gather again. When she stood up and headed back to the living area where the baby was still crying, she closed her eyes for a moment. Lord, please help me soothe her. It breaks my heart to see her so upset. Please guide me, Lord. I might not be her mother, but right now I'm the closest thing she's got to one. Katie scooped the baby up and held her close. It's all right, Darla baby. We'll figure out what's troubling you. Darla sniffed against her shoulder before a fresh wave of sobs escaped her. Just then, the soup on the stove began to boil. Katie reached for a wooden spoon, but before she could put it in the pot, Darla's gums closed around the edge. Silence reigned in the small cabin, and Katie darted a glance in Letty's direction. Letty burst out laughing. Teething, she is, Letty said, shaking her head. Should have thought of it. If I were you, I'd find another spoon. If you take that one now, she's going to cry all over again. Katie chuckled as she glanced at the baby girl chewing on the wooden spoon. Sometimes the answer was right in front of you. You just had to stop searching for it. She gently set the baby in the crib with the wooden spoon and watched as Darla attacked the spoon with intent. A smile curved the corners of her mouth. She might not be a mother, but for the first time, she imagined how triumphant a mother must feel when they finally did something right. Chapter 12. Colorado Springs, 14th of February, 1882. The first few days after Katie's arrival, Jasper struggled between guilt and regret. He felt guilty for luring Katie here without giving her the whole truth and regret for liking her. After Darlene passed away, he was certain he would never have those feelings for another woman again. He couldn't help but feel guilty for marrying Katie and knowing he would never feel about her as he had about his first wife. At first, she had been hesitant around Darla, almost as if she was afraid of his baby. But as time moved on, she seemed to thaw toward Darla, but become all the colder towards him. Now and then Jasper would catch her glancing in his direction. Whenever that happened, he felt his heart skip a beat. At first, he had thought it was the guilt, but as the weeks moved on, it was hard to deny that he had come to like her. Although Katie was clearly not interested in him, Jasper couldn't help but feel his affection slowly growing for her. Her cornflower blue eyes lit up whenever she held Darla, although he was sure she would deny it if he mentioned it. But it was her smile that made his heart begin to race. It was Sunday morning, and like most Sundays, Jasper tried to keep the noise down to allow his mother to lie in for a few more hours. Even Katie had picked up on quiet Sunday mornings after only a couple of weeks. He dressed and made his bed before heading to Darla's room. He usually picked her up and took her on a walk before returning to the house for breakfast. As soon as he stepped into Darla's room, he knew something was wrong. Her lantern was off, and the crib was empty. Fear clutched at his heart as he moved through the quiet house. He rushed towards Katie's room, but her bed was also empty. Even as nightmares began to unfold in his mind, he rushed outside to saddle his horse. She couldn't have gone far. He ran the distance to the barn and raced inside only to hear the crooning sound of Katie's voice. Jasper stopped in his step to see Katie standing in front of his bay mare, allowing Darla to touch the horse's muzzle. He was about to chasten her for bringing Darla out in the cold when he noticed how warmly Darla was dressed and how she was wrapped in a thick blanket. It was clear that Katie hadn't taken the time to dress. Her nightdress peeked out from beneath her thick coat, and her long blonde hair tumbled over her back in waves. It was such a contrast to the usual braids she wore, and she looked so much younger. His heart simply stopped, making him take a step back. He never expected to feel this way ever again, and now, standing in his barn, he found himself falling in love with his wife. Right at the moment of his realization, she turned and caught sight of him. Jasper? Jasper cleared his throat, trying to string together a few words, but words failed him as Darla and Katie both watched him curiously. I just came to check on the horses, he trailed off. Katie cocked a brow. You thought I took her? Her brows furrowed with indignation. Jasper was about to argue when he came to the decision that it wouldn't help if he lied. I woke up and she was gone. So were you. Katie frowned, shaking her head. She was crying for most of the night. I think she's teething again. I got her down in the early morning hours, But when she began fussing again, I didn't want her to wake your mother. We came out here instead. Jasper felt like the dirt on the bottom of his shoes. She had tried to be considerate, and he'd assumed the worst. I'm sorry, Katie. Is she better now? Katie shrugged. She's not wailing anymore. Only then did Jasper notice the dark rings beneath Katie's eyes. You're tired. Katie smiled weakly. Didn't get much sleep. Jasper nodded as he moved towards them. He wanted nothing more than to wrap them both in his embrace, but instead, he reached only for Darla. I'll take her now. You can get some sleep. Katie held his gaze for a moment before she let go of Darla. I won't hurt her, and yet you keep doubting me. Perhaps it's best if I leave after all. She didn't wait for his answer. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away. Jasper felt like a dog when he saw her shoulders sag with defeat. Ever since those first few days, she hadn't mentioned leaving again until now. Jasper couldn't help but wonder if it meant she didn't feel the same way about him and Darla as they did about her. It was clear Darla adored her, although Katie wouldn't admit it. He watched Katie cross to the house and slip inside. For the first time since her arrival, he couldn't regret her coming to Colorado Springs. She might not want to take care of Darla or even want to be there, but Jasper couldn't stand the thought of her leaving. Somewhere between writing that first letter out of desperation and finding her in the barn with his daughter, Jasper had to admit he had fallen in love. Now that's a problem, Darla, he whispered to his daughter. He couldn't help but feel as if he was betraying Darlene by loving another woman. Why don't you and I take a walk? Darla gurgled, clearly over her crying spell. Jasper wrapped her tighter in her blanket and headed outside. He had a destination in mind, and although it would be a tough walk in 3 feet of snow, he knew he had to go there right now. Slowly, he made his way around the barn and up the hill. By the time he reached the top, he was gasping for breath. Darla's cheeks were pink from the cold, but she didn't complain. She was too fascinated by the sights and sounds nature had to offer. He used his boot to kick away the snow until it revealed the large rock he had placed there 8 months before. Usually, tears would bring him to his knees and grief would overwhelm him, but not today. Today, he looked at the rock with fondness and his heart swelled with all the memories he had to cherish. If you only knew how many times I wished you were still here. Jasper trailed off with a sigh. What should I do, Darlene? I didn't want to fall in love with her. I wanted her to help me take care of Darla. A little girl needs a ma. But now, everything's a mess. Darla's hand reached up and grazed his cheek. Jasper looked into his daughter's eyes and wished he had the answers he needed. A Bible verse came unexpectedly to mind, one that Jasper had read a few months after Darlene's death, come to think of it, right before he had written that first letter. Isaiah 43:19, "For I am about to do something new. See, I have already begun." The words repeated themselves in his mind, and the more he thought on it, the more he realized the verse was the answer to his problems. Falling in love again might feel like something new, but it's already begun. When he lost Darlene, Jasper didn't have a choice, but this time he did. He could either cling to the past and drown in the future, or he could embrace the future and let go of the past. For the first time, Jasper realized that letting go of the past didn't mean letting go of the memories. He would always have his memories with Darlene to cherish, but it was time he thought of his future. He drew in a deep breath of cold mountain air and closed his eyes. What he saw made a smile curve his mouth. He saw a future with Katie, where she wasn't just living here because she had no other options, but where she loved him and adored both Darla and their son. The vision disappeared as quickly as it came, leaving Jasper breathless. Turning, he glanced towards the cabin and the smoke billowing from the chimney. It was time he put the reasons for bringing Katie here in the past. It was time he tried to embrace a future that would bring them all happiness. Chapter 13. Colorado Springs, 30th of March, 1882. Katie sat on the porch after putting Darla to bed. Spring was in the air. She could feel it in the melting snow and the balmier afternoons, but her heart hadn't yet thawed against the thought of being a mother. Every time she thought she knew what she was doing with Darla, the little girl would prove her wrong by fussing even more. At 9 months old, Darla had started to crawl, and although she brought many smiles to Katie's face, Katie still felt betrayed at being lured here under false pretenses. Taking care of the little girl just affirmed her notion of not wanting children. Some might describe her as being selfish, but she couldn't fathom the thought of the rest of her life being occupied with taking care of a child. The responsibility was just too much. To make sure the child was fed, bathed, educated, and well-mannered. It lay before her like a mountain even taller than the Rockies. A heavy sigh escaped her as a tear slipped over her cheek. She had promised Jasper she would stay until she could make other arrangements, but what other arrangements were there to be made? Although she wasn't completely over the moon with the responsibility of a baby, she couldn't help but admit that she'd never been happier than she was right here on the ranch. The wide open spaces and big skies had captured her heart, although the baby still hadn't. A star skipped across the galaxy and a smile curved her mouth. She could remember seeing stars in New York, but not as many and none as bright. She couldn't imagine ever wanting to go back to New York again. 5 Points held absolutely no allure after seeing what life could be like. But that didn't solve her problem. She adored Letty. The old woman had become her best friend since Susan. But it was the father and daughter pair that confused her. She liked Darla and knew that the affection that made her smile also scared her. How could she love another woman's child when she didn't even want children of her own? Her childhood flashed before her, and Katie shook her head. She couldn't stand the thought of Darla getting hurt or suffering in life. More importantly, it was Darla's father that confused Katie. Katie knew that Jasper never intended to seek a romantic relationship. It was very clear to Katie that he only wanted someone to take care of his daughter. But that didn't mean her heart had played along to his rules. The tall, handsome rancher had captured her heart and he didn't even know it. The way he was with Darla, the kind way he treated his mother, and the gentle, soothing voice he used with the animals. Katie didn't want to love him or even consider falling in love with him, but Jasper Wilkinson had stolen her heart, and she had no idea how she would ever get it back. If she was honest, it might be just Jasper who was keeping her on the ranch. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a dream had started to take form. A dream of Jasper loving her just as much as he loved Darlene. She could hear it in his voice and see it in his gaze whenever he spoke of Darla's mother. To be loved by such an imposing man must be overwhelming and truly special. But there was no love for her on this ranch, only another woman's daughter needing her care. A sigh escaped her just as she heard the door creak behind her. She turned and was surprised to find Jasper standing in the doorway. Although she saw him without his hat every evening, the sight of his eyes unobscured by the hat's shadow still made her heart skip a beat. "You not headin' to bed?" Jasper asked without moving. Katie glanced towards the sky and shook her head. "No, I'm going to stay out here for a spell. It's a beautiful evening." Kisity. She expected him to bid her good night and disappear inside, but he stepped out on the porch and took a seat beside her. Mind some company? They had never sought out each other's company, and Katie was certain that wasn't what was happening now. It was merely Jasper wanting to be outside while she happened to be there. "Sure," Katie nodded as she briefly glanced his way. She wished his eyes could be more readable in the moonlight. But right now, they were just dark depths of midnight. They sat in silence for a while before she could take the silence no longer. Katie turned to him with a questioning look. "Was there something you wanted?" Jasper frowned and shook his head. "No. Should there be?" She shook her head and couldn't help but feel uncomfortable beneath his gaze. She could feel his eyes on her and wondered if he regretted her presence. She was certain he was grateful for the help with Darla, but that didn't mean he enjoyed having her around. Feeling out of place, she stood up. "Good night, Jasper," Katie said quietly. Jasper met her gaze, and Katie almost thought he smiled. "Good night, Katie." She escaped to her bedroom, and as soon as the door closed behind her, she let out a sigh. "Lord, please help me. I do not know what to do. He doesn't want me here. He only wants me to take care of his daughter, and I don't even think I'm doing that well. Please help me." Help me find a way to leave this ranch, to make a life for myself elsewhere. I can't compete with the love he felt for his wife. I can't compete. I please, Lord, guide me and help me. Amen. Katie reached for her Bible, hoping to find a verse that would give her some direction on what she should do. 1 Peter 5:6-7. Humble yourselves then under God's mighty hand, so that he will lift you in his own good time. Leave all your worries with him, because he cares for you. The verse was as if the Lord himself had spoken to her. Katie read it again and felt a tear slip over her cheek. Perhaps it was time to stop worrying about the future and try to find happiness in the present. She wasn't sure how she could do that, but she knew she had to at least try. Chapter 14, Colorado Springs, 10th of April, 1882. Need to start burning the waste, Jasper said before taking another mouthful of beef. Yep, you should get on that in the morning, Letty agreed. They were all sitting down to dinner, and now and then Jasper couldn't help but glance at Katie, who was feeding Darla with a broad smile. Darla adored Katie. Jasper felt a responding smile form on his mouth when she suddenly looked up and met his gaze. His heart skipped a beat before he quickly turned to focus on his plate again. I thought you buried the waste in the big hole out back? Katie asked, confused. Letty chuckled. You haven't been here in summer yet, hun. We burn the waste in summer. Don't got no bears prowling around in winter. Bears? Katie's mortified cry rang out. Jasper couldn't help but chuckle. Got a few that come down from the mountains in summer. They usually don't mean no harm, only curious. But even a curious bear is a dangerous one. But you have fences, Katie trailed off. Jasper nodded. Fences don't keep bears out. As long as we burn the waste and keep an eye out, we're fine. Haven't had a bear close to the cabin in 5 years. He could almost hear Katie's sigh of relief. Then I won't be going out. It's summer, long sunny days, and meadows filled with flowers. You'll be going out, he said confidently. Katie smiled at him, and for a moment Jasper's heart simply stopped. There was no use in denying his feelings for Katie anymore. She had been in their home for 4 months, and once he had put the guilt aside, he couldn't help but appreciate her beauty and her fierce personality. She was nothing like the soft-spoken Darlene he had lost, but she had captured his heart nonetheless. You'll be just fine, Letty said, filling the awkward moment. Katie got up and scooped Darla into her arms. I've got to give this one her bath and put her down. Letty, dinner was wonderful, thank you. My pleasure. Tomorrow night's your turn. Katie smiled. Stew it is, then. She moved towards Jasper and leaned down so he could kiss Darla goodnight. Although his lips brushed over his daughter's forehead, it was Katie's scent that enveloped him like a woman's embrace. Katie stepped back, and then she disappeared down the hallway. Jasper couldn't help but feel lost the moment she left the table. For some reason, she had become the person he wanted to spend time with. He wanted to know more about her, but every time he attempted a conversation that didn't involve Darla, she fled like a hunted deer. I've seen that look in your eye before, Letty said quietly. Jasper turned and saw his mother's curious gaze on him. What look? He asked, hoping he could hide his feelings from his mother. The look you had in your eye when you came home and told me you were marrying Darlene. That look. Letty didn't bother mulling over her words. Jasper was about to argue before he simply let out a sigh. This time it doesn't matter. Who says? Letty asked quietly, making sure Katie wasn't privy to their conversation. I say, I don't know what to do, Ma. It's clear she doesn't want to be here. She hates me for lying to her. Although she takes care of Darla, it's like she refuses to admit that she loves her. Maybe it's time I just bought her a return ticket back to the East. Letty huffed and shook her head. You giving up that easily? Didn't raise you to throw your hat down after not even trying. His mother got up and gathered the plates, leaving Jasper speechless. It took him a moment to realize what she meant. You don't think she hates me? Letty chuckled. Hate's a strong word. And prasadi sent. Might be she's a little mad at you still, but she doesn't hate you. Maybe if you stopped accusing her of not caring for Darla well enough, she might warm to you. Jasper was about to argue when he recalled questioning Katie's methods of taking care of his daughter. He didn't know much about children, and couldn't help but be overprotective of his daughter. Then I guess I'd better change my approach. I think I love her, Ma. Letty turned to him with a broad smile. Knew you'd see sense sooner or later. She's a good woman, a real good one who's had a hard run of it. She deserves to be happy. You find a way to give her that. Jasper nodded. He wasn't sure how he was going to do it, but his mother was right. Katie deserved to be happy, and he didn't want her to find that happiness anywhere but right here on his ranch. Chapter 15. Colorado Springs, 2nd of May, 1882. Although she was still petrified of bears, Jasper had been right. Summer lured Katie outdoors almost as often as Darla begged her to go. The sunrises were no longer freezing, and the sunsets brought an end to long days on the ranch. As time moved by at a snail's pace, Katie found herself falling deeper and deeper in love with the towering mountains, and if she was honest, the man who had closed his heart to love the very day he had closed the lid on his wife's coffin. It was hard for Katie to see Jasper every day and know he'd never feel the way she did. But she consoled herself by being grateful for her surroundings and, if she was really honest, the little girl who brought a smile to her face every day. She woke up just before dawn, and a smile curved her mouth even before sleep was pushed aside by wakefulness. This was a special time of the morning, the time before Darla woke up demanding her attention, the time before Jasper would be in the kitchen, eyeing her over his cup of coffee, as if she was intruding on his morning. She slipped on her shoes and dragged a blanket around her shoulders before quietly making her way out of the cabin and onto the porch. It was barely 5 o'clock and night still hovered on the horizon, being slowly pushed aside as morning started to break. Katie opened the door and stepped out on the porch before dragging in a deep breath of the fresh morning air. A smile split her face in two as she tasted pine and earth in the breeze. Nothing could compare to this feeling of freedom, she thought as she heard a noise to her right. She turned to see Jasper sitting on a rocking chair with a smug grin. "I'm sorry, I'll leave," Katie said quickly. Jasper shook his head and patted the seat beside him. "Take a seat, Katie. I won't bite, just savoring the sunrise." Katie hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should take the olive branch or not. Finally, the rays of the sun touching the horizon convinced her. She took a seat and couldn't help but wish he wasn't there. Just his presence made her feel off balance. Over the last 2 weeks, he had been trying to be nicer to her, which she appreciated, but she couldn't help but wonder if it was simply because his mother had told him to lighten up. She let out a contented sigh, realizing she was still wearing her nightdress. Tugging the blanket tighter around her, she sneaked a glance at Jasper. He looked so calm and at peace that it made her heart swell in her chest. With him completely unaware, she allowed her gaze to linger on his face. He was a handsome man with calloused hands, but it was the kindness and the gentility she'd seen him show that called to her. He turned and met her gaze. Instead of looking away as she usually did, Katie held his gaze. His brown eyes lightened just like the horizon that was being touched by the sun's early morning rays. For a moment she could swear there was no derision or anger in his expression. Her heart began to race, wondering what it meant when the moment was interrupted by Darla's shrill cries. Katie moved to fetch her, but before she could, Jasper stood up and touched her shoulder. "Stay, I'll fetch her." Katie nodded, but only realized she had held her breath once he disappeared inside. She wasn't sure if Jasper realized it, but for a short while it had felt as if they were a family. Mom and Dad were up before sunrise before the children woke. The thought scared her, but it also gave her hope that maybe one day they could be just that. She wasn't sure she could ever replace Darlene as a mother when it came to Darla, or as a wife when it came to Jasper. And she couldn't help but wish that someday she might at least come to mean something to him. She no longer considered New York to be her home. This was her home. The only problem was that the man she wanted to share her heart and her future with wasn't seeking the same dreams she had. The door creaked open, and Katie couldn't help but be surprised to see Jasper had wrapped the 10-month-old Darla in a blanket and brought her straight outside. "Think it's about time she started appreciating the sunrise as well," Jasper said with a smile before taking a seat. Katie shifted, feeling a little awkward. Suddenly, the sunrise had become so much more. Suddenly, it had become a taste of the dreams she dreamed every night. A dream in which Jasper and she loved each other. A dream in which they shared everything. Just a shame she had a feeling he would never be ready to share his heart. "She's going to want a bottle soon," Katie said, searching for an excuse to escape the moment. Jasper turned to her with a grin. "She'll hold. Sit with me, Katie, just a short while longer." Katie's heart skipped a beat at the tenderness in his voice. It was the first time he asked her to spend time with him. The first time neither of them sought an excuse to leave. The first time she didn't want to. A smile curved her mouth as she leaned back and relaxed into the chair. Chapter 16. Jasper cuddled Darla on his lap, surprised that Katie didn't flee like she usually did. He took a chance and glanced at her, surprised to find her eyes on him. For a moment their eyes met and held, and for the first time since he had admitted his feelings to his mother, he felt as if there was hope. He knew that this wasn't the life Katie imagined when she came to the West, but he also didn't imagine losing his wife on the day he was blessed with his daughter. If the last few months had taught him anything, it was that life often took unexpected turns. It was almost a year since he lost Darlene, and although he still loved the memory of her, she was in his past. Katie was his future, and if he wanted her to remain his future, it was time he began to court his wife. Jasper hadn't courted a girl in years and wasn't sure he would find the right words or that his tongue wouldn't tie. A lot had changed since he courted Darlene. For one, he was now a father and a widower. He knew what it felt like to have loved and lost. The thought of losing someone again terrified him, but he couldn't stand the thought of living the rest of his life on happy memories. He wanted to make new memories, not just for himself, but for the sake of his daughter. Katie was watching him with large eyes, clearly waiting for a reason to slip away. Jasper felt a grin tug at the corners of his mouth. "I like your hair down. It looks pretty." If it was possible, her eyes widened even more as she self-consciously touched her hair. "It's all mussed from sleep. I wasn't sure anyone would be awake yet." Jasper nodded. "I often come out here in the mornings to see the sunrise, but usually you beat me to it. But you've never." Katie trailed off, realizing that he didn't come out because he didn't want to interrupt her moment of peace. "You do enough during the day, Katie. The least I can do is offer you the privacy of the porch if you want to watch the sunrise alone." Jasper trailed off, already hoping she would argue. She didn't argue. Instead, a wry smile touched her lips. "I don't mind sharing the sunrise. This is nice." Jasper nodded in agreement. "It is." As if wanting to add her opinion, Darla piped up, "Dada." Jasper and Katie both laughed as they turned to the little girl. Darla smiled, very proud of herself. "Dada." Jasper turned to Katie, searching her gaze. "Did you teach her that?" Katie shrugged. "We might have taken her vocabulary further than gamma and num-num." Jasper laughed, but quickly stopped when he realized Darla didn't yet have a word for Katie. He wasn't sure Katie would appreciate being called Mama, since she was so clearly against having children, but he could try something else. "Darla, who's that?" He pointed at Katie, making Darla giggle. "Kiki." Katie's sweet laughter flowed over Jasper as Darla kept repeating the word. "I guess you're Kiki. Any objections?" Katie laughed again. "How can I object when it sounds so cute the way she says it? You're becoming a clever girl, aren't you, Darla?" Darla touched her nose. "Baby." "You're right, you're a baby girl," Katie crooned. Jasper's heart swelled in his chest, watching the interaction between his daughter and Katie. Instinctively, he reached for Katie's hand and searched her eyes. "Thank you, Katie. I know this wasn't what you expected and that I was wrong to lie to you, but thank you." Katie didn't pull her hand back at first. Instead, she smiled at him with forgiveness in her gaze. "I might not have expected this, but the sunrises are even better than I expected." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something, Jasper thought, smiling at her. Prosody rate percent. Jealous of not being involved anymore, Darla leaned towards Katie as well, grasping for her hands before giving up and holding out her arms. "I think she wants you." Katie laughed. "Of course she wants me. She wants her bottle." Katie took Darla, but instead of getting up to make Darla's bottle, she sat down again, and Darla snuggled against her chest. Together, the three sat and watched the sun make its ascent. Jasper knew that they had taken giant leaps this morning in their relationship. He also knew that if he wanted to court Katie, he had to take his time. If he moved too fast, he might just scare her off forever. When Darla finally began to fuss for her bottle, Jasper wished he could spend more time with them, but knew it was time for him to start his day. He had cattle to check, fences to fix, and horses to feed. He got up and smiled at Katie as she too stood up. "How about tomorrow we do this again? I'll come out. If you get here first, promise to do the same." Katie hesitated for a moment before she nodded shyly. "I will." "Good. See you for breakfast." Jasper walked away, but not without a skip in his step. Chapter 17. Colorado Springs, 15th of June, 1882. After sharing the sunrise as they had most mornings since May, Katie had gotten to work. It was Darla's first birthday today, and Katie wanted to make it special, not only for Darla, but for Jasper, who seemed down this morning. It was also the anniversary of Darlene's death, after all. She had baked a cake this morning, and the decadent aroma was drifting through the yard. She would decorate it later in the afternoon. But right now, she had another project that needed her attention. Since Darla wouldn't stay awake later than sunset, she planned a picnic beside the house. They would have cold cuts of beef, a salad or two that she'd made from the kitchen garden, and some sweet tea that Letty had made for the occasion. The only problem was that the underbrush had grown so thick since winter that she needed to clear a spot for their picnic first. Jasper had left early that morning to check the fences, although Katie had a pretty good feeling he would be spending most of the day on the hill overlooking the house. The hill on which Darlene was buried. Her heart ached for him, but she knew he wouldn't want to be consoled by the woman who had taken his wife's place. Although she might act as a mother to Darla and be his wife on paper, Katie knew she would never have Jasper's heart. She had come to love the little girl, but still couldn't imagine ever wanting children of her own. She wanted to keep Darla safe and happy, but she couldn't see herself as a mother. If anyone thought she minded being called Kiki, they were wrong. She didn't want or deserve to be called Mama by the little girl. "Good heavens, Katie, you'll break your back before you clear out all those shrubs," Letty said, coming down from the porch. "I want it to be special. I don't want Darla getting hurt if she crawls on the blanket and a hard rock or a broken shrub pokes into her knees." Letty smiled warmly. "Why don't we go see if there are some sickles in the barn? Surely it would go faster than you trying to aim with an axe. You'd sooner chop off your feet." Katie laughed, knowing Letty was right. "I didn't even think of a sickle. Where's Darla?" "She's down for her nap," Letty said with a relieved smile. Letty had offered to take care of her so Katie could take care of the birthday preparations. "Don't you want to take a lie down as well?" Katie asked as she moved around the corner of the house. "In a bit, I'll help you some first," Letty offered. Katie was about to argue, but she could see Letty enjoyed the warmer weather just as much as she did. The older woman probably wanted to spend a little time in the sun as well. Together, they walked to the barn. The scent of hay and animals filled her senses as they moved to the corner where Jasper kept the tools. "Axe, axe, axe! How many axes does Jasper think we need?" Letty said, searching on her side. Katie chuckled. "A lot, apparently. What's this?" She pointed to a funny-looking large metal object. "A plow. A sickle looks like a thin piece of curved metal. Wait, just let me see here," Letty said, lifting something. The sound of the rattler's tail sounded before either Letty or Katie saw the slithering snake. Letty jumped back and Katie cried out in fear. The rattler, apparently started by the shrill noise, quickly slithered away through a hole in the wall of the barn. "That was close." Letty breathed a sigh of relief. "Too close." Katie sighed as she spotted a sickle. "There it is." She rushed forward and grabbed the sickle quickly before moving away. Letty laughed. "It won't have a friend. You can relax. I think I've had about as much excitement as I can take." Katie smiled over her shoulder as she walked out of the barn. "Go lie down. It'll go quickly with the sickle as long as I don't come across another rattler." As soon as they stepped out of the barn, both women froze on the spot. Letty's hand clutched Katie's wrist like a vice. Katie felt her heart stop before adrenaline surged through her veins with fear. "What do we do?" Katie muttered under her breath, careful not to draw attention to themselves. She could feel Letty quiver with fear beside her. "I don't know." "I know we shouldn't run." Katie nodded as she kept her gaze on the porch. At the front door, a black bear was ambling its way into the cabin. When it disappeared out of sight, she couldn't help but feel relief wash over her before terror gripped at her heart, squeezing the breath out of her body. "Darla," Letty's hands flew to her mouth. "If we go in there now, we'll be mauled." "If we don't, Darla will be mauled," Katie argued, trying to tug her arm free. "We'll get Jasper, Katie." "He'll know what to do," Letty urged, but Katie was already moving. "I'm not waiting for Jasper." With no concern for herself, Katie carefully moved towards the house. The bear was in the kitchen, and Katie instantly realized it must have been the scent of the honey cake that lured him closer. She glanced over her shoulder at Letty. "Find Jasper." "Katie, no," Letty called out as Katie began moving closer to the house. Katie didn't even bother to stop, trying to think of a way to get inside without drawing the bear's attention. Remembering the window on the other side of the house, she quietly moved around the house, grateful to see the window hadn't been latched. Carefully, she found a rock to give her some leverage before hoisting herself through the window. She bumped her elbow but didn't dare cry out. When her dress got caught on the frame, she ripped it free. By the time she slipped into the room, she was wearing only her pantaloons and the bodice of her dress. She glanced around for a moment, fascinated by the neatly made bed. This was her first time in Jasper's room. She didn't allow herself to admire it for long before she slipped into the hallway. All she had to do was get into Darla's room without attracting the bear's attention. Her heart was racing a mile a minute, her breath coming in short pants, but she moved as quietly as possible. As soon as she was in Darla's room, she closed the door. She stood by the crib watching the girl sleep and wondering how she would be able to defend her if the bear sought them out. She closed her eyes, trying to hear where it was. She could hear things falling in the kitchen and knew the bear was probably feasting on Darla's birthday picnic, but that didn't matter now. In the corner of the room, she spotted an umbrella. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She picked it up and held it like a weapon in the direction of the door. Then she heard the floorboards in the hallway creak. Her heart stopped, knowing the bear was coming closer. She prayed for Darla not to wake or make a sound, but as fate would have it, Darla began fussing at that moment, instantly drawing the bear's attention. When his paw scraped against the door, Katie wished she had thought to find Jasper's shotgun before she left his room. Now she was trapped with Darla, with no means to protect them. She closed her eyes as the bear continued to claw at the door. "Dear Lord, please protect us. Please don't let him get through. Please, Lord, please don't let harm come to Darla. Please, Lord, help me to protect her from this bear." When the door slammed open and the bear sauntered through it, Katie could only wish her prayer had reached the Almighty. If she had been terrified then, it was nothing compared to the moment the bear reared up. He was taller than a man. His loud growl made tears spring to Katie's eyes, even as Darla began to wail. Katie looked the bear in the eye and knew that today was the day when Jasper might have to dig more graves. Chapter 18. Jasper happened to be up on the hill when he noticed his mother and Katie go into the barn. All morning he had promised he would visit Darlene's grave, but he had postponed because he had something important he had to tell her today, something he needed to get off his heart. He kneeled by the rock that served as a marker for her grave before taking off his hat. "Our little girl turned one today, Darlene. She's wonderful. She's so much like you and so much like me. She's the perfect combination of us, although I hope she doesn't let her boots lie around like I do. I know you hated that." His heart clenched with grief, but he pushed on. "It's been a year since I said goodbye to you, my love. A year of missing you and missing all the plans we had made together. I want you to know that I'll always love you. I'll always keep you in my heart, and I'll tell Darla about you. But there's something I need to tell, or rather ask you today. I'm in love with Katie, Darlene. She's turned into a wonderful mother for our daughter, and she's found a place for herself in my heart. I didn't think it would be possible, but it was. I've struggled with this, but it's time I was honest with you and with myself. I want to move on, Darlene. I want to think of the future again. You'll always be my past, my first love, but I want Katie to be my future. Somewhere in my mind, I think that's what you would have wanted. A breeze cooled his neck, making him glance down the hill towards the cabin. Completely distracted, he turned back to the grave. I love you, Darlene. I promise to visit you often. Maybe I'll bring Katie to meet you. A frown creased Jasper's brow as he realized what he'd just seen. He stood up and glanced at the house again, just as he saw the back end of a bear go through his front door. Fear gripped his heart even as he raced for his horse. He was in the saddle only a breath later, kicking the horse into a gallop. He saw Katie round the house and climb through a window, leaving her skirts snagged behind in the window frame. He leaned forward on the horse, praying it would go faster and blaming himself at the same time for not leaving a shotgun at the cabin. He only had one and usually took it with him out on the range. You never knew when you might come across a hungry mountain lion or a curious bear. Never in a million years did he imagine a bear going into the cabin. As he neared the barn, he saw his mother's wiry frame trying to rush towards him. Jasper! Bear! Jasper jumped from the saddle and grabbed his shotgun, shouting over his shoulder to his mother. Go to the barn, close the door. His mother didn't argue. Instead, she turned and did as he said. As Jasper ran towards the house, a million prayers sounded through his mind. For God to protect Katie, to protect Darla, to protect everything he loved. When he reached the porch, he knew he had to slow down to assess the situation. He glanced through the windows and saw no sign of the bear, which could only mean it was in the room, with Katie and Darla. Fear made his knees wobble, but he drew in a deep breath to regain his strength before quietly moving through the door. He heard the bear growl and could hear his daughter's startled cries. His instinct had him aiming for the bear's rear end, visible from the hallway, but he dropped the end of the gun knowing an injured bear was more dangerous than a hungry one. Instead, he forced himself to move into the far corner of the living room, praying his plan would work. He cocked the shotgun and aimed it towards the roof. 3 shots could be heard for miles around as they sounded in short succession. Jasper closed his eyes, praying it would work. Healing you. He heard a stumble and a growl, and the bear crashed against the dining room table before darting out of the cabin. It was luck or prayer, Jasper realized as soon as he moved towards the door to see the bear hightailing it towards the tree line. He dropped the shotgun on the table before rushing towards the room. Katie was standing in the middle of the room with the umbrella, aiming as if it was a sword, Darla wailing at her back. He could see her arms quivering and pure terror in her gaze. At that moment, he realized he wasn't just in love with the fearless girl from New York. He loved her as his wife in every way it mattered. He rushed towards her, pulling her into his embrace. She had put herself between his daughter and the bear. She had been willing to risk her life for Darla. Tears burned his eyes when he heard her sobs of relief against his chest. He didn't notice that she was wearing only her pantaloons or that she'd scraped her elbow. All he cared about was holding her until the tears stopped. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, knowing that he couldn't have loved her any less. I love you. The words slipped from his mouth before he even realized it. Katie looked up at him with wide eyes. Jasper? I mean it, Katie. I love you. I didn't want to love again. Jasper brushed his lips over hers and felt his world tilt upright again for the first time in a year. When he drew back, Katie's eyes searched his. Behind them, Darla had stopped crying and was fascinated by the scene playing out beside her crib. Chapter 19. At first, Katie had thought the words were meant for Darla. But when Jasper's lips brushed over hers, there was no denying that he'd meant them for her. A frown creased her brow even as she searched his gaze. But she had so many questions, so many things she wanted to know, but before she could say another word, Letty rushed into the house. "Katie! Jasper!" Letty rushed into the room and came to a brisk halt when she saw Jasper holding Katie in his arms. Katie glanced at Letty, feeling a blush color her cheeks. "Well, clearly I'm not needed here," Letty chuckled. "I'll just take the young gun and give you some privacy." Jasper stood back, his hand reaching for Katie's. "Why don't you put on a new dress and join me for a walk? Ma, will you take care of Darla?" Letty winked at Katie. "We promise we won't invite any bears to the birthday party." Katie chuckled, suddenly feeling self-conscious in her pantaloons. Jasper held her gaze for a moment before he left the room. Letty lifted Darla, but stopped in front of Katie with a warm smile. "If I knew it'd take a bear, I would have lured one into the cabin a long time ago." Katie couldn't help but laugh, still feeling overwhelmed by what had just happened. She rushed to her room and took a moment just to catch her breath before she changed into a new dress. Once she was changed and her heartbeat had returned to its normal pace, she went outside to find Jasper. She found him standing by the spot she had cleared for the picnic. "Planning something?" "A picnic for Darla's birthday, but now, what if the bear comes back?" Jasper shook his head with a wry grin. "He won't, but I'll fire a shot a few times for the rest of the day to be sure." She nodded, unsure how to proceed. The moment they had just shared was so special, but it felt as if it couldn't be regained. Just as she thought she had imagined the love in Jasper's gaze, he moved towards her and reached for her hand. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to the top of her hand before smiling at her. "Let's you and me take a walk. I figure we both got some talking to do." Katie nodded. As they walked towards the meadow behind the house, she couldn't help but realize that when the bear had threatened Darla, she didn't care that she wasn't Darla's real mother. All she cared about was protecting her little girl. Her little girl. The thought ricocheted in her mind, and Katie knew that Darla would never be hers if her father did not also want Katie. The meadow was filled with new blossoms of wildflowers. Jasper stopped at the edge and gazed up towards the mountains. "You know, I never wanted to love again. I needed a mother for Darla and knew I had to lie or no one would have answered my advertisement," Katie sighed. "I was so angry." "Are you still angry?" Jasper asked. Katie thought for a moment before she shook her head. "No, I'm not. She's a precious little girl." Katie frowned, realizing it was time for her to make an admission of her own. "The reason I was so upset wasn't so much about you lying about having a daughter as it was about having a child. I was raised in an orphanage, Jasper. I never wanted children. I thought that this life brought nothing but strife, and I didn't want to have a child only to see it suffer." Jasper frowned and brushed his thumb over her cheek. "Not only strife, Katie, love and happiness as well. Do you think Darla feels strife and suffering when she smiles at you?" "You bring her happiness, Katie, just like I hope she brings you happiness." Katie couldn't help but smile. "She does. She makes me so happy, but I'll never be." Jasper frowned before he searched Katie's gaze. "Katie, you're her mother in every way that counts. Darlene might have birthed her. We might have had her through the love we felt for each other, but you're Darla's ma. You're the one who sat up with her during the night. You're the one who soothed her when she teethed. And you're the one who was about to attack a black bear to protect her. You might not have wanted to be a mother, but you've become one." Katie felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth as she realized he was right. "I am, aren't I?" "You are, but there's something else I'm hoping you'd be as well." "What?" Katie asked, not sure where this was leading. She could hope, but she wouldn't know for sure until Jasper said the words. "I'm hoping you'd be my wife as well." "Katie, I know I was wrong, and I've apologized too many times to count, but I want us to be a family. I want to feel like a family all the time, and not just for a few minutes every morning when we're watching the sunrise. I want to love you and protect you, and one day when you're ready, I want to have more children with you." Katie's heart felt as if it would explode out of her chest at his words. It was everything she could have wished to hear. For a man that she could never read before, she suddenly understood every nuance of his face. The smile that curved, hoping she would say yes. The frown that doubted if she would. His eyes searched her gaze, praying for an answer that he could live with. A smile began to curve her mouth as she framed that strong, chiseled jaw. Jasper, I wasn't looking to be a mother. I hoped to be a wife, to possibly even find love, but mostly just to find a safe home and to live without starving between meals. You've given me that. Although I might not have been happy about the way you went about it, you gave me that. This place. The ranch, the mountains, you and Darla and Letty, you've become my home. I want nothing more than to be your wife, in every sense of the word. I want to know that when you look at me, it isn't with derision or guilt because of Darlene. I want to know that when you kiss me, it isn't because you miss her. I want all of that, but I can't live in her shadow. Jasper sighed and stepped back, his gaze falling to the dirt. Katie felt her heart clutch, knowing he couldn't give her what she needed most. But when he suddenly turned and met her gaze, there was laughter in his eyes. Do you know where I was when I saw the bear? I was with her. I went to see her because I had something to ask her, or tell her, rather. Katie frowned, not understanding. I went to tell Darlene that I've fallen in love with you, that she'd always be my past and I'll always cherish her memory, but I wanted you to be my future. You won't be living in her shadow, Katie, because you are the sunrise on my grief. The words were so poetic, coming from a rancher, that they brought tears to Katie's eyes. I love you too. She stepped into his waiting embrace and felt her heart explode with love. This might not have been the life she imagined, but just like most of God's blessings, it was so much better. Come on, Jasper said after holding her for almost 5 minutes. Let's go celebrate Darla's birthday, because we still have to move your things into my room. Katie giggled even as a blush colored her cheeks. She might have been a married woman for 6 months, but at that moment she felt like a wife for the first time. Epilogue. Christmas Eve, 1882. What are you making? Jasper asked, scratching his head as he peered into the pot on the wood stove. Katie smiled over her shoulder at her husband, who seemed to become more handsome with every day. Posset. I ain't never heard of that before. Looks to me you're wasting good milk. Jasper shrugged. Just don't expect me to drink it. Letty clucked her tongue from her seat beside the fireplace, with a blanket over her legs. You'll drink it 'cause she went to the trouble of making it. Ma, did you see what she put in there? That wine I got from the merchant, and milk, and now she's adding spices. Posset, Katie began explaining. I had it a few times in New York at a friend's house. Apparently it's been made in England since medieval times. Now we just need an egg, and then it's done. Whatever it is, it smells wonderful, Letty added from the fireplace. Mama, when is Santa coming? Darla asked, tugging at the hem of Katie's dress. Katie leaned down and scooped her onto her hip. Soon, honey, just as soon as we go to bed, he's going to slip down the chimney and leave some gifts. But he'll get an ouch. It's hot, Darla said, exasperated. Santa won't get an ouch. He's got magic. Jasper's deep rumble of laughter beside her made her look up and meet his gaze. Just this once? He pleaded. Katie shook her head. Traditions are the foundations of family, Jasper. This is one tradition I never had growing up. Let me give her this, please. Jasper smiled warmly and pressed a kiss to Katie's cheek. I'll let you have Santa if I can have Darla. He plucked Darla off Katie's hip and twirled her away. I want Santa, Darla cried out, confused. Katie laughed as she began scooping the hot, fragrant liquid into cups before moving to the fireplace. Once everyone had a cup, and Darla had a small mug that Jasper bought especially for her in town, she began telling the story of Christmas and Jesus' birth. Darla listened wide-eyed, but it was Jasper's gaze and his hand on her knee that warmed her heart. Katie never imagined having a loving Christmas, and this year she was being blessed with just that. Once the story was finished, Letty offered to put Darla to bed. Jasper sighed contently as he sipped the last of his eggnog. This hot curdled milk tasted pretty good, Katie laughed. I told you so. Have you brought the horse in from the barn? Jasper nodded, pointing to a blanket covering something in the corner. Do you think she'll like it? It's just a head on a stick, Katie smiled. For Darla, it's going to be her first pony. We're so blessed to have you, Katie. I wish I thought of a gift I could give you, but I'm afraid all I can offer you is my heart. Jasper had turned out to be quite the romantic once they had found each other. He had a way of saying things at the most unexpected moments that simply melted Katie's heart. Just like Susan, she had found her happiness in a newspaper. It was still sometimes hard to believe. "That's a shame because I have a gift for you," Katie said with a mischievous grin. Jasper frowned. "But you haven't been to town. Did you make me some tin? Don't tell me this posset juice is my gift," he asked in disgust. Katie shook her head. "It's called posset and it's not your gift." Katie glanced at Letty, who was standing at the end of the hallway waiting for her to finish. She reached for Jasper's hand and gently placed it on her belly. "Merry Christmas, Jasper." Jasper frowned before his eyes widened. "But wait, I thought you didn't want children?" Katie shrugged. "Healy, prosody rate percent. I didn't want to marry a broody rancher either, but it seems the things I didn't want are the things I love the most." "We're having a baby?" Jasper asked excitedly. "I'd say around summer," Katie said with a smile. "I'm about 3 months along if I guess correctly." Jasper drew her in and held her close. For a moment she could feel his breath catch with emotion before he pulled back and searched her gaze. "This is the best Christmas ever." Katie didn't have to doubt his words, because she could see in his eyes that he loved her more than life itself. It warmed her heart to know that he had loved before, because she knew without a doubt that a man like Jasper deserved to be loved. Every night before she fell asleep in his arms, she thanked the Lord that she was lucky enough to be the woman who loved him.